Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. January 29th, 2019, New Rochelle, New York. 24-year-old Valerie Reyes was expected at work that morning at Barnes Noble. She never arrived. Within days, a red suitcase was discovered off a quiet Connecticut road. Inside was the answer no family ever wants. This crime began inside an apartment where nothing looked broken and ended on a roadside where everything was. From the outset, the case demanded attention. Valerie had no history of vanishing without a word. She was described by her family as reliable, caring, and anchored in routine. Her absence was immediately abnormal. Within minutes of her being marked absent at work, concern spread. By later that day, her family had contacted local law enforcement to file a missing persons report. The apartment she lived in showed no forced entry. Her belongings were intact. There were no visible signs of a struggle. Detectives logged it as a quiet anomaly, a woman vanishing without the telltale indicators of abduction or voluntary flight. In American casework, no forced entry plus a missing person often points to someone the victim trusted. That inference, however, could not yet be confirmed. The first hours of any disappearance are crucial. Detectives followed standard protocol: calls to local hospitals, checks of license plates for her car, and inquiries at transit hubs. Negative results came back across the board. There were no hospital admissions, no traffic stops, and no ticket purchases. Her digital footprint fell silent after 3 in the morning when phone records showed the device switched to airplane mode. Investigators noted that silence as a working anomaly. Within 24 hours, officers canvassed Valerie's neighborhood. Neighbors reported nothing unusual in the night hours. No shouts, no visible disturbance, no suspicious vehicles parked nearby. It was as though Valerie had simply stepped into darkness and not returned. For family and investigators, that silence was louder than anything else. Early press releases emphasized that a young woman was missing and asked the public for assistance. Community concern was immediate. New Rochelle was not known for high levels of violent crime. A disappearance of a 24-year-old bookstore employee cut sharply against the city's profile. Tips began to trickle in, but none placed Valerie beyond her apartment after late evening on January 28th. Procedurally, detectives began to prioritize timeline reconstruction. They established the last confirmed communication between Valerie and a friend late on the night of January 28th. They noted that by dawn on January 29th, she was absent from her shift. By midday, she was officially a missing person. By evening, her case had been escalated to the Westchester County Task Force that handles high-risk disappearances. The absence of phone activity after 3 a.m. left investigators with limited digital guidance in the critical first days. Without pings or calls, there was no location data to triangulate. That meant the case leaned heavily on testimony, neighborhood canvass, and financial records. Detectives emphasized to the family that every small detail mattered. The tone of her last conversation, any mention of travel, any unusual contact, none emerged. Forensic procedure in these first days is about elimination. Was this voluntary absence? Was this an accident? Or was this a crime? Each possibility was logged, tested, and methodically ruled out. No travel bookings meant no planned departure. No hospital entry meant no known accident. That left the third possibility climbing towards probability. Family interviews provided one additional point. Valerie had expressed unease in the days before she vanished. She told her mother she felt unsafe, as though something bad might happen. Investigators entered this as preliminary testimonial evidence. At this stage, it was context, not proof, but it shifted the perception of risk. By the second day, detectives had drawn a geographic chain: New Rochelle apartment, potential commuting corridors, and regional transit points. No security footage confirmed her movements beyond her complex. The working assumption was that she never left the area alone. Investigators pressed further. Why did her phone stop transmitting at 3 a.m.? Who, if anyone, was with her in those hours? These questions framed the case moving forward. In towns like New Rochelle, murders aren't just crimes, they fracture the sense of safety for everyone. That fracture was widening by the hour. As the first week closed, detectives knew 3 things. Valerie was missing, her phone had gone dark, and no voluntary exit explained her absence. It was no longer a question of whether a crime had occurred, but of where the evidence would surface. The first week of Valerie Reyes's disappearance passed with little physical evidence to guide investigators. Then, early in the morning of February 5, 2019, sanitation workers in Greenwich, Connecticut, noticed something unusual along a narrow stretch of Glenville Road. They were tasked with clearing debris, but one object stood out: a red suitcase left just off the roadside embankment. Suitcases are common items in urban transit hubs, but abandoned along a semi-rural road. In winter, it was immediately out of place. They approached and found the zipper strained. Out of caution, the workers contacted the local police department before handling it further. Responding officers arrived within minutes, secured the location, and treated the suitcase as suspicious. When unzipped under controlled conditions, the discovery inside removed any doubt. Human remains, frozen and bound. This was no accident scene. The body was identified later as that of Valerie Reyes, the missing 24-year-old from New Rochelle. The suitcase became the first and primary crime scene. The scene itself was stark. The body inside was positioned with the wrists and ankles restrained. Duct tape covered much of the lower face. Clothing was consistent with what Valerie would have worn in daily life. Nothing suggested she had packed or prepared to travel. The cold conditions of early February in Connecticut meant the remains were partially preserved, slowing decomposition. For forensic investigators, this preservation provided clearer opportunities to log injury patterns and determine the cause of death. Greenwich police immediately cordoned off the area, calling in state forensic technicians. Photographs were taken of the suitcase, its position relative to the road, and the surrounding ground. Investigators noted no extensive drag marks leading from the road to the drop point. That suggested the suitcase had likely been lifted from a vehicle and set down directly. This pointed to vehicular involvement consistent with transport from another location. The forensic chain began here. The suitcase was collected, sealed, and sent to the Connecticut State Crime Lab under strict custody protocols. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office for autopsy. Evidence tags covered every binding, piece of tape, and fiber present. Officers documented the weather conditions, sub-freezing temperatures, which had kept the remains in a rigid state. That environmental detail would later prove relevant in estimating the timeline of death. Back in New Rochelle, detectives received word that the missing person case they had been working was now formally a homicide. The family of Valerie Reyes was notified, and investigators began linking their missing person timeline to the homicide scene in Greenwich. Interagency cooperation was activated immediately. New Rochelle Police and Greenwich Police, along with state forensic teams, now shared jurisdictional interest. The autopsy provided preliminary results. The medical examiner observed evidence consistent with asphyxiation: tape over the mouth and nose, constriction of the airway, and bruising patterns on the head and upper body. These findings pointed toward homicide by restraint and suffocation. Defensive wounds suggested Valerie had resisted. This aligned with her being bound while still alive, attempting to break free. At this stage, investigators faced a clear procedural problem. The disposal site was not the site of death. The lack of significant blood evidence at the roadside, combined with the manner of placement, confirmed that Valerie had been killed elsewhere and transported. That meant investigators had to track not just who had motive, but who had the means and the opportunity to move a body across state lines. Forensic technicians took fibers from the suitcase interior, adhesive samples from the tape, and swabbed for potential DNA beyond the victim's own profile. These items became critical to the working evidence list. Detectives logged them as physical evidence pending analysis, noting that the bindings and suitcase itself might retain traces from the perpetrator. As the discovery reached the public, media outlets reported that a missing woman's body had been found in Connecticut. While details remained restricted, residents in both New Rochelle and Greenwich were on alert. For a quiet commuter town, the appearance of a suitcase containing a homicide victim on a roadside was jarring. As one investigator quietly noted, "In towns like this, murders aren't just crimes. They tear at the fabric of community security." Procedurally, the discovery meant detectives could now build the case outward. They had a time-stamped discovery, forensic evidence in custody, and a confirmed victim. The next step would be reconstructing how Valerie's body left New Rochelle and arrived in Greenwich. Vehicles, rental records, and surveillance along transit corridors would all become part of that reconstruction. By the end of that day, law enforcement had shifted from searching for a missing person to following a homicide investigation that crossed jurisdictional boundaries. The red suitcase, once an abandoned roadside object, now anchored the case. From it would flow forensic profiles, DNA comparisons, and adhesive trace analysis, each a step closer to identifying who had the opportunity and intent to end Valerie's life. When a homicide moves from missing person to confirmed death, the focus turns to what remains measurable: data. Valerie Reyes's phone, her bank account, and surveillance logs became the next forensic layer. While the suitcase gave investigators the first physical evidence, the absence of blood at the disposal site made clear the crime had occurred elsewhere. The only way to trace movement was through her digital footprint and financial transactions. Investigators began with her phone records. Telecommunications logs showed that at approximately 3 in the morning on January 29th, her device switched to airplane mode. From that moment forward, there was no signal, no text, no call. In digital casework, silence can be more telling than activity. The cutoff point created a timestamp, a narrow window when she was last known to be alive and her phone operational. It also told detectives the device was manually altered. Phones do not enter airplane mode on their own. That timestamp became the baseline for the rest of the investigation. Detectives cross-referenced it with Valerie's last confirmed conversation with a friend the night before. She was coherent, normal, and gave no indication of leaving town. Hours later, her phone went dark. Bank records added another layer. Starting later that morning and continuing over the next several days, cash withdrawals were made from Valerie's account. The total exceeded $5,000. Multiple transactions took place at ATMs in the New Rochelle and Queens area. The amounts were small enough to avoid immediate flags, but steady enough to appear deliberate. ATM cameras provided more than time and amount. Surveillance footage captured an unidentified male withdrawing cash using Valerie's card. The figure wore a hoodie, partially obscuring facial features, but vehicle glimpses appeared in background frames. Detectives noted a compact SUV entering and leaving parking lots at times consistent with the withdrawals. This became the next lead, cross-checking rental records for that make and model. Forensic accountants examined transaction sequencing. Withdrawals began within hours of Valerie's disappearance. This timing indicated that whoever controlled her movements also had access to her debit card and PIN. In cases of random stranger abduction, PIN acquisition is rare. In cases involving known offenders, it is common. That distinction shaped the working theories. Investigators also reviewed her credit and online purchase activity. No legitimate transactions occurred after January 28th. No voluntary bookings, no ride-hailing charges, no retail purchases. Negative evidence supported the conclusion that Valerie had not orchestrated her own departure. The timeline tightened. 3 a.m., phone silence, followed by cash withdrawals beginning just hours later. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. Investigators recognized that while the digital trail pointed outward, it was still incomplete. They needed to link the ATM activity to a physical vehicle, then link that vehicle to an individual with access to Valerie. At this point, subpoenas expanded. Law enforcement requested video from nearby businesses adjacent to ATMs. Each new camera angle offered fragments: a side profile of the hooded figure, partial plates on the SUV, and a clearer shot of clothing. These fragments were compiled into a working composite of behavior, not just identity. Detectives wanted to know not only who, but how. Meanwhile, Valerie's employer confirmed no paycheck activity after January 28th. Payroll records provided context. Her disappearance was not connected to financial trouble or sudden flight. Friends reported no unusual spending or loans. The withdrawals had no connection to her personal patterns. The digital void of her phone contrasted with the active exploitation of her bank account. That duality reinforced investigators' suspicions. Valerie had been silenced, while her resources were drained by someone else. In law enforcement terminology, this was a clear marker of post-offense behavior, concealment combined with financial gain. The forensic sequencing of this chapter of evidence showed investigators a pathway. The ATM withdrawals narrowed geography to a specific corridor. The vehicle glimpses pointed to a rental source. The phone silence fixed the starting point of the crime. Together, these elements began to close the circle. As one investigator reflected in later reports, when the phone goes dark, the body doesn't always appear, but when the money starts moving, you know someone is out there risking exposure. That risk became the pressure point. By the end of this phase, detectives had three anchors: the 3 a.m. airplane mode event, over $5,000 in fraudulent withdrawals, and ATM footage showing a hooded male with access to Valerie's card. The case was moving from uncertainty to identifiable patterns. From here, the focus would shift to victimology, understanding who Valerie was connected to and who had both access and motive. In criminal investigations, the focus eventually shifts from the evidence of what happened to the question of who the victim was. Detectives know that to understand a crime, they must first understand the person whose life was taken. In the case of 24-year-old Valerie Reyes, this step was crucial. It was not enough to follow phone logs and bank withdrawals. Investigators needed to see her life in context, her fears, her relationships, and her patterns. Valerie lived in New Rochelle, a quiet suburb north of New York City. She had a stable job at a local bookstore, she lived independently, and she was known by friends as dependable. Those who knew her best described her as friendly but private, someone who kept her struggles to herself. To investigators, those details mattered. Victims who are cautious and routine-driven rarely vanish on their own. The weeks before her disappearance held important markers. Friends later told police that Valerie had expressed a sense of unease. She worried about safety, about being harmed, and even voiced that fear in conversations. In forensic psychology, these disclosures can become key. They are not evidence by themselves, but they establish that the victim anticipated danger. Law enforcement built what is known as a victimology profile. They reviewed her digital life, her text messages, and her social circles. Preliminary analysis showed no signs of drug use, no risky behavior online, and no abrupt changes in employment. Negative evidence can be just as important as confirmed leads. The absence of instability reinforced that Valerie had no motive to disappear voluntarily. Detectives focused on her closest connections. A 24-year-old with a relatively small circle means attention turns quickly to family, co-workers, and past intimate partners. Friends confirmed that Valerie had recently ended a relationship. This was noted in the working theory but not shared publicly at the time. Investigators knew that in many homicide cases, the perpetrator is not a stranger, but someone once trusted. The escalation in the case became evident when bank withdrawals overlapped with Valerie's disappearance. Investigators had already determined that the person accessing her funds was not her. That raised the likelihood that someone close to her had both her financial information and the opportunity to act quickly after she went missing. Behavioral analysts considered the combination of fear Valerie expressed and the rapid exploitation of her resources. This pointed toward premeditation, or at least familiarity. Offenders who panic rarely take the time to drain accounts systematically. But here, the withdrawals stretched across days, suggesting a perpetrator who thought they had time to conceal the crime. In towns like New Rochelle, crimes like this do not only shatter one family, they unsettle entire communities. Residents followed updates in the news, seeing a once familiar face on missing posters. The sense that someone local, young, and cautious could vanish raised collective anxiety. For detectives, escalation meant they had to narrow suspects. Victimology provided criteria. Valerie had lived independently but kept regular contact with her mother. She was reliable at work, and she was not known for risky behavior. This profile cut against the theory of a stranger abduction. Instead, it pushed investigators to focus on someone in her orbit who could silence her phone, access her card, and dispose of her body without raising alarms for nearly a week. Interviews confirmed Valerie was not careless with her financial information. Her debit card PIN was not written down nor saved digitally. That meant the person withdrawing funds had either forced her to reveal it or had learned it through intimacy. Either scenario kept suspicion close to her personal relationships. Investigators also analyzed the way Valerie's remains were disposed of. A suitcase taped, left in a wooded area in Greenwich, Connecticut. This was not a random highway dump, nor was it an attempt at burial. It suggested someone who knew they had limited time, wanted concealment, but not a long-term hiding strategy. Disposal methods can reveal offender psychology. In this case, it suggested panic, not precision. By mid-investigation, the victimology profile had established 3 key points. Valerie had voiced fear of harm before her death. Her lifestyle showed no voluntary flight risk. The exploitation of her finances suggested someone with access and familiarity. These insights moved the case from a broad missing person framework to a focused homicide inquiry centered on personal relationships. The next step for law enforcement was clear: identify the individuals in her life who fit that proximity and opportunity. For Valerie's family, victimology was more than a forensic exercise. It was validation that she was not reckless, not careless, and not responsible for her disappearance. It reframed the public conversation away from speculation and toward accountability. By the time investigators had pieced together Valerie Rhea's victimology, the case had moved into its next phase, charging theory. In homicide investigations, this stage is where evidence collected from multiple sources, physical, digital, and testimonial, is aligned into a coherent narrative that can withstand the scrutiny of prosecutors and eventually a jury. For Valerie's case, it was the point where the scattered data points began to merge into one trajectory, pointing toward a suspect who was no longer a shadow, but a person with means, motive, and opportunity. The financial trail was the first key. Within hours of Valerie's disappearance, her debit card had been used at several ATM machines across New York and Connecticut. Surveillance cameras captured transactions, though often with obscured faces, hoods, or angled lenses. Yet the timestamps created an undeniable pattern. Someone was actively withdrawing cash at intervals that suggested deliberate use, not random chance. This became confirmed evidence, each withdrawal mapped to a time and location, each transaction tied to Valerie's account. Prosecutors know that money creates one of the strongest chains of evidence. An offender who accesses a victim's finances demonstrates both possession and intent. Here, the exploitation of Valerie's bank account supported a working theory. The offender not only caused her death but also sought to benefit from it. That element alone elevated the case from unexplained disappearance to a federal-level crime of kidnapping resulting in death, a charge with severe consequences. The forensic team then layered in the phone data. Valerie's device had been silenced, switched into airplane mode around 3 in the morning of January 29th. Negative evidence mattered. After that moment, there were no outgoing calls, no texts, and no reactivation. Phones do not simply vanish from networks unless manually disabled. Combined with the financial withdrawals, this suggested the offender had both Valerie's card and access to her personal belongings. Geography tied the threads together. The timeline placed Valerie last seen in New Rochelle. The financial withdrawals tracked a path outward, aligning with major roadways that led into Connecticut. Then came the discovery of her body, concealed in a red suitcase off a quiet stretch of road in Greenwich. To prosecutors, this created a straight geographic chain. Disappearance, financial exploitation, and disposal of remains all traced along a corridor that was logical, consistent, and prosecutable. At this point, investigators tested their charging theory against common defenses. Could the financial activity have been a random theft unrelated to her death? The timing undermined that argument. Withdrawals began immediately after Valerie's last known activity. Could the suitcase have been placed by someone else? Forensic handling protocols showed it contained bindings, tape, and fibers consistent with restraint, leaving little room for coincidence. Interview strategies also fed the charging theory. Detectives re-interviewed friends, family, and acquaintances searching for inconsistencies. They found that Valerie's recent breakup remained a point of tension in her personal life. While the name of the former partner was not disclosed publicly at that stage, the working theory grew stronger. Someone familiar with Valerie, someone with access and emotional connection, had escalated into violence. Forensic psychology supported this angle. Offenders in intimate partner-related homicides often display a blend of panic and opportunism. The suitcase disposal, the rushed ATM withdrawals, and the disabling of her phone matched that profile. Panic in the moment, followed by attempts to control the aftermath. Prosecutors later used this behavioral framing to establish intent. Even if the initial act was argued as accidental, the subsequent actions showed consciousness of guilt. The autopsy findings added another dimension. Valerie's body showed signs of restraint and suffocation, consistent with her being incapacitated while still alive. This eliminated alternative explanations such as sudden natural causes or accidental overdose. It confirmed homicide as the manner of death. In forensic case building, such confirmation is critical. Prosecutors cannot advance charges without a clearly established cause and manner of death. By now, investigators had constructed a case that could be presented in charging documents. The sequence was clean. Valerie vanished in New Rochelle, her phone silenced, her finances exploited, her body found bound and concealed in Greenwich. The working theory: she was restrained, transported, and killed by someone known to her, who then attempted to profit from her death and conceal the evidence. But charging theory is not only about evidence, it is also about narrative coherence. Jurors, like investigators, respond to a clear timeline. In Valerie's case, the clean transitions between her last known activity, the digital silence, the financial exploitation, and the discovery of her remains provided that coherence. Prosecutors could tell a story that was not speculative but sequential, each link backed by physical or digital proof. For the community, this stage represented progress. What began as a haunting mystery, a young woman gone without trace, was now reframed as a solvable crime, with evidence pointing inward rather than outward. Families following the case felt the shift. Media reports reflected it too. Valerie's death was no longer covered as a missing person case, but as a homicide investigation approaching its conclusion. From an investigative standpoint, the charging theory also justified escalation to federal jurisdiction. The crossing of state lines from New York into Connecticut triggered federal statutes. Combined with the financial exploitation, it gave prosecutors additional leverage. Kidnapping resulting in death is one of the most severe charges in federal law, carrying penalties as high as life imprisonment. This was no longer just a local homicide, it was a federal case. As prosecutors refined their charging documents, detectives prepared for the next step, confronting the suspect. They needed not just suspicion, but admissible statements corroborated by forensic evidence to move forward. The trial of Javier da Silva Rojas was not the product of a rushed arrest or a single confession. It was built piece by piece from phone records, ATM surveillance, forensic recovery of bindings, and testimony from investigators who had followed the trail across state lines. By the time federal prosecutors presented their case in court, the chain of custody was clear. The timeline was anchored by digital evidence, and the jurisdictional questions had been resolved through coordination between New York and Connecticut authorities. The courtroom phase carried less spectacle than some high-profile trials, but it held weight. Valerie Reyes, 24 years old, had her final story told not just by her family, but by the documents and recordings she left behind. Prosecutors outlined for the jury that her disappearance was not random, nor was the disposal of her body in a red suitcase off a quiet road in Greenwich. Each element tied back to deliberate acts that connected directly to the defendant. Forensic evidence that had been gathered months earlier now became exhibits. The tape used to bind Valerie's hands and cover her face was chemically matched to rolls recovered from Da Silva's possession, confirmed by adhesive pattern analysis. The suitcase, once a chilling discovery in the woods, was introduced with chain of custody certification. Surveillance stills from the ATMs showing multiple withdrawals in the days following Valerie's disappearance were paired with timestamps and machine logs. Those images gave jurors a visual anchor. Valerie was gone, but her bank card kept moving through the city in someone else's hands. Digital analysis also featured prominently. Cell tower mapping placed Da Silva's phone near Valerie's residence the night she disappeared, and later along the route into Connecticut where her remains were abandoned. While not every ping was exact, the sequence was consistent with the vehicle path investigators had reconstructed earlier in the case. Coupled with withdrawal points, it created a forensic geography chain that was hard to dismiss. The defense did not deny that Da Silva had been with Valerie, nor that he had transported her body. Instead, arguments leaned on intent and circumstance. His attorneys claimed the death was the result of a fight that escalated and that panic, not premeditation, explained the bindings and the suitcase. They presented his cooperation in confessing to federal agents as evidence of remorse. The goal was to push the case toward manslaughter rather than a more severe conviction. Prosecutors countered by underscoring the sequence of actions: Valerie's phone being placed on airplane mode at 3 a.m., her absence from work later that morning, and cash withdrawals that occurred while her family was still reporting her missing. These were not the hallmarks of panic alone, they argued, but of choices made to conceal, evade, and benefit. Each detail became part of the charging theory: that kidnapping had directly resulted in her death and that federal jurisdiction was warranted. Testimony from Valerie's family underscored what the forensic data already implied. They described her routines, her reliability, and the sudden silence that fell after the night she disappeared. This was not a woman prone to vanishing. Jurors listened as family members recounted unanswered calls and text messages, reinforcing the negative evidence already logged. No phone activity, no voluntary withdrawals, no confirmed sightings. Forensic pathology confirmed what had been suspected from the scene. Valerie had been restrained, her airway obstructed, and her body concealed. While the defense tried to frame the death as accidental, the manner of restraint and the effort to transport her body in a suitcase were inconsistent with an unplanned event. The medical examiner's report removed ambiguity. The cause of death was asphyxiation associated with restraint. The verdict phase carried less suspense than the early investigation, but for Valerie's family, it carried the weight of finality. In 2020, Javier da Silva Rojas was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to kidnapping resulting in death. It was not a state-level homicide trial with a jury deliberating murder charges. It was a federal proceeding focused on the interstate nature of the crime. That detail mattered. The moment Valerie was transported from New Rochelle into Connecticut, the case moved into federal scope. For those who had followed the investigation, the sentencing brought clarity but not comfort. A young woman had lost her life, and no sentence could fully reconcile that loss. Yet the conviction ensured accountability. The forensic sequencing, from phone records to ATM footage to adhesive analysis, had held together under scrutiny. What had begun as a missing person report ended in a federal courtroom where facts prevailed over speculation. The trial highlighted another reality. Crimes that cross state lines demand coordination. And this case demonstrated how agencies from New Rochelle police to Connecticut detectives to federal prosecutors can align evidence into a single prosecutable narrative. Without that cooperation, the case risked fragmentation. With it, there was a clear line from Valerie's last known presence in her apartment to the courtroom where her name was finally given justice. For viewers of this case, the detail to consider is how fragile those hours were, how within minutes a life can shift from routine to irreversible, and how later that night decisions made in panic can transform into a federal crime. The law interprets those actions not by emotion but by evidence, and in this case, the evidence spoke clearly. The sentencing of Javier da Silva Rojas closed the courtroom phase, but it did not close the wound left in New Rochelle. Valerie Reyes's family faced the reality that justice could only deliver accountability, not restoration. Her name remained in files, news clips, and community vigils, a constant reminder of how quickly a young woman could vanish and be found under such grim circumstances. Law enforcement reflected on the case as a lesson in coordination. From the discovery of the suitcase in Greenwich, Connecticut, to tracing ATM withdrawals in New York, multiple agencies had to merge evidence seamlessly. Federal jurisdiction under kidnapping statutes ensured that moving Valerie's body across state lines did not fragment the prosecution. Officers later pointed to this case as proof that rapid interagency alignment can secure a conviction when evidence is spread across borders. Forensic handling was another focus. Adhesive bindings, suitcase materials, and digital phone data were all logged under strict chain of custody rules. Each step was reviewed before trial to withstand appeals. The Reyes investigation became a model in training sessions for how methodical documentation can preserve credibility in a high-profile crime. The case also emphasized the narrow window of intervention. Within minutes of Valerie's disappearance, her phone went silent. Later that night, unauthorized financial activity began. By the time her body was located 6 days later, the outcome was irreversible. Investigators now cite this timeline as evidence of why early subpoenas for phone and bank records are essential in missing person cases. For Valerie's loved ones, the impact was deeply personal. They urged greater awareness of warning signs in relationships. Isolation, secrecy, sudden financial control. The danger in Valerie's case came not from a stranger, but from someone she once trusted, a reminder that threats can emerge inside personal circles. Community forums in New Rochelle turned grief into action with scholarships and safety programs created in Valerie's memory. Journalists covering the case stressed that behind every crime headline stands a family still living with consequences long after sentencing. For investigators and prosecutors, the memory of opening that suitcase in winter conditions never faded, a human imprint carried alongside the procedural success of securing a 20-year federal sentence. In January 2019, Valerie Reyes vanished from her home in New Rochelle, New York. 6 days later, her body was discovered inside a red suitcase left in a wooded area of Greenwich, Connecticut. She was bound with duct tape, her phone had gone into airplane mode around 3 a.m., and her bank account showed multiple withdrawals. Each of those details became central in the investigation. The evidence was consistent: surveillance images of stolen card use, forensic analysis of the duct tape, and the defendant's own admission of his role in her death. The path of movement, New Rochelle to Greenwich to the New York bank cameras, formed a clear chain that prosecutors presented in court. In 2022, Javier da Silva Rojas, her former boyfriend, was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for kidnapping, resulting in death. The outcome confirmed the state's case and brought legal closure. Valerie's story reminds us that even small digital traces, an ATM camera, a missing phone signal, can build an unshakable case in court. It also leaves behind a human lesson that personal safety in relationships must never be overlooked, and that justice, though delayed, can still speak with clarity. Final note: Valerie Reyes, 24, lost her life in 2019. Her killer was convicted in federal court. The crime was solved, the sentence handed down, and her memory endures beyond the courtroom. Looking back on Valerie's story, I can't help but think about how fragile life is and how the choices we make in relationships can shape everything. As someone who's walked you through this case, I want to leave you with this: stay alert, trust your instincts, and remember that your safety is never negotiable. True crime stories like this aren't just about tragedy. They're reminders of the strength communities find in seeking justice and protecting one another. What do you take away from this case? Share your thoughts below. Tell me where you're watching from or what stood out most to you. And if this video touched you, don't forget to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story.